Of you who are just joining, my name is Leslie Babinski. I'm the director of the Center for Child and Family Policy here at Duke University. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for this next session. It is my pleasure to introduce Patricia Cole today. Patty, a Duke alum, is the Senior Director of Federal Policy at 0 to 3. In that role, she leads 0 to 3's work in federal policy formulation and legislative strategies in a range of areas affecting infants and toddlers, including early care and learning, home visiting, child welfare, infant early childhood mental health, and healthcare. Patty has over 30 years of experience in policy at the federal and state levels. Prior to her current position, she was consultant on children and family policy, working with 0 to 3 and the National After School Association. Patty's also served as staff to Senator Chris Dodd, chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Children and Families. She was responsible for oversight of key programs and was instrumental in legislation that included 2 reauthorizations of Head Start and the creation of Early Head Start, reauthorizations of the Human Services Act, the Child Care and Development Block Grants, the Family and Medical Leave Act, and the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. Thank you, Patty, for all the work that you've done to improve the lives of children and family, and we're so looking forward to talking with you today.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be presenting this lecture for the Duke Sanford Center for Child and Family Policy, which is something I never dreamed of when I was at Duke, where I studied medieval and Renaissance history, and to also be part of this conference looking toward the next step in early childhood policy. I'll start by telling you a little about 0 to 3. It was founded over 40 years ago by an interdisciplinary group of researchers and clinicians dedicated to infants and toddlers. Our mission is to ensure that all babies have the opportunity to thrive and reach their potential. We do this by translating the science of early development for parents, practitioners, and policymakers. The nonpartisan 0 to 3 Policy Center was established about 20 years ago, and we champion policies to make our babies' potential a national priority. We are a full-service policy shop working to drive change and baby policy through 5 divisions focused on federal and state policy, advocacy, and 2 content areas: child welfare, which includes the Infant Toddler Court Program, and the Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Group. We're going to take a wide-ranging tour of baby policy today to explore both why we focus on young children and how they would benefit from universal policies. So we're going to start with a snapshot of the state of America's babies. We'll talk about how we frame the agenda for young children and their families and look at how far we've come. We'll talk about Build Back Better and what it could have meant for babies, as well as what's ahead. And then we'll look at another aspect of universal policies, those that directly support families. And finally, we'll touch on how you can help with advocacy. There are approximately 11.5 million infants and toddlers in the United States. We need each and every one of them to fulfill their potential if our country is to be strong in the future as they confront the problems that we grown-ups will be leaving them. Yet too often their early experiences threaten to undermine their development, reaching that potential at risk. I know the science is familiar to this audience. The development that takes place in the first 3 years lays the foundation for all that follows. Babies are born wired to learn, forming 1 million neural connections a second. And that early development is shaped by experiences, which in turn is important because it takes place within early relationships that are the context for the experiences and are essential for human development. Because babies are also born wired to feel, they need to form a close relationship with their primary caregivers that assures them that becomes their base from which they explore and learn. When babies don't have what they need, when the circumstances of their families' lives create uncertainty about their security, they don't develop as they should. So what do we know how they and their families are faring? 0 to 3 created the State of Babies yearbook to tell the story of babies by looking at some 60 indicators of well-being and policy responses across the 50 states and DC. I'm excited to share that we are this year adding a profile of Puerto Rico. So we place the states in 4 tiers according to how their babies are doing overall. I encourage you to go to the website to read the report, explore the interactive data profiles for your state, and we'll talk later about how to help them use them in your policy work. But most important, you can, in a few days, you'll be able to register for a virtual Capitol Hill briefing, excuse me, to release the State of Babies Yearbook 2022 early in May. But the key takeaway is that not all babies have the ingredients to thrive. The state where a baby is born and grows up can make a difference, but disparities that are apparent by race and income cut across state lines as inequities begin early. So let's take a look. The first thing we see is that America's babies are a diverse group. Slightly more than half are children of color. But even as we celebrate this diversity, we see that the story of babies in the US is one of inequities. Well, where children of color or those in families with low income have different experiences that can undermine their ability to reach their potential, or at least place hurdles in their path that they don't need. These inequities grow from a combination of economic factors and systemic racism that have limited equitable access to resources like quality health care, well-paying jobs, and housing. And these are fundamental to family stability and well-being. In fact, these inequities start before birth. The 2021 yearbook data showed that significant racial disparities persist on two critical indicators of infant health: preterm births and low birth weight. Black infants in particular are much more likely to have birth outcomes that place them at higher risk developmentally. Racism drives disparities in maternal and child health that Black and American Indian, Alaska Native women and their children especially experience. It increases stress and weathering. It limits access to high quality health care, and it reduces the quality of care that is actually received. When we look at birth outcomes by state, we see this pattern persist. While babies in Connecticut, which is one of the highest ranked states, are doing somewhat better overall, including babies of color, but the pattern of significantly worse outcomes for Black infants persists, just as it does in Oklahoma, which is in the lowest tier. The most basic indicator of child and family well-being is income. Babies and young children are the age group most likely to live in poverty in our country. Almost 1 in 5 lives in outright poverty, and 2 in 5 live in families with low income. That includes those in poverty, and that's concerning enough. But when we look at income by race and ethnicity, we see that for American Indian, Alaska Native infants and toddlers, and Black infants and toddlers, that rate is 3 in 5, over 60% living in families with low income, and almost that high for Hispanic infants and toddlers. The implications of so many very young children developing in precarious economic circumstances with such startling racial inequities are alarming. Poverty at an early age is particularly harmful. It literally gets under the skin through chronic, unrelenting stress that can be toxic to the developing brain if children are not buffered by responsive, stable relationships. State of Babies gives us more insights into the experiences of young children and how they differ by income. Infants and toddlers and families with low income are more likely to experience factors that can be detrimental to development. Compared with children in families above low income, they're 3 times more likely to live in crowded housing, about 80% more likely to live in an unsafe neighborhood, 3.5 times more likely to have 2 or more adverse experiences by the age of 3, and their families are much more likely to report less resilience. Note that low income has other implications, such as not being able to take advantage of policies like unpaid family and medical leave, because women of color are more likely to be in jobs that either aren't covered or have lower wages. They may not be able to afford unpaid time off. In California, their paid family leave study showed that that policy itself increased equity in the ability of women of color to take leave. All of these conditions can produce the stress that can become toxic for our babies. And because of the intersection of race and ethnicity with poverty and low income, babies of color are more likely to have multiple adverse experiences than the national average. And this applies to some of the other indicators as well. In our third area of positive early learning experiences, we don't have national measures of early development and learning, but we do know what proportion of infants and toddlers receive some basic early care and learning opportunities and services. If we look at families with low or moderate income who could benefit from a subsidy to defray the high cost of infant toddler care, which often can exceed the cost of public college, only 44% receive a subsidy. Early Head Start has been proven to improve early development of babies in poverty and their parents' ability to support that development, but only has space for 11% of income-eligible infants and toddlers. Developmental screening can identify developmental problems early and lead to intervention services that can mitigate these delays, but only a third of babies receive one, and even less for babies in families with low income. Now, the indicators from State of Babies are all pre-pandemic because we use large national databases that are slow to update. We obviously have been living in very different times for the past 2 years, and young children are experiencing the pandemic environment with this sustained economic hardship and emotional stress during the period of most rapid brain development. So we turned to the Rapid Survey Project to obtain data on families with infants and toddlers during the pandemic. And the 2022 yearbook will again feature this database. Many young children may be in danger of actually having the pandemic indelibly imprinted on their brains and bodies. Research is emerging that suggests some young children are in fact being impacted developmentally by the past 2 years. And as we know, this risk is not experienced equally. If we look at the data, disparities have only deepened with the pandemic's health and economic effects. During the first year of the pandemic, close to half of families with babies experienced a decrease in income. Black and Latinx families were the most likely to experience a decrease and less likely to experience no change. Experiencing economic hardship and an inability to meet basic needs such as food and housing creates a chain reaction where parents' emotional stress grows and is transmitted to their young children. The survey findings also show that higher levels of financial hardship not only increase emotional distress in parents, but also it tracks with a corresponding increase in signs of distress that they're seeing in their babies. So the data from before the pandemic already showed that babies and families face challenges that warrant attention from policymakers. But framing that agenda can be a challenge. Policymakers are often puzzled by the idea of addressing the needs of babies and families in policy. And even when they become familiar with early brain development, they still may not see a clear connection. They might believe government has no role, or it feels that it costs too much, that we just simply can't afford the policies that families need. They may default to pre-K, which of course is an important opportunity that every child should have. But we really need to help them understand that we don't want to let our babies fall behind until they're 3 or 4 before we worry about their development. Now, I'm the first to admit and even embrace that a baby policy agenda is not simple. But the question that we must ask is simple. How do we reach every baby and family and support them in nurturing strong, positive development in their babies? Sometimes it's good to go back to your roots, and policy is no exception. For me, it's returning, at least virtually, to Duke University, where I spent happy, productive years as an undergraduate and graduate student. And if you heard that I was a history major, you won't be surprised that as I look at 0 to 3 policy, it's a 1992 report called Heart Start, the Emotional Foundation of School Readiness. The report talked about the importance of social emotional development and how it is nurtured, which was actually a fairly radical idea back in the early 90s. When I first ran across the report, I was surprised, though, at how close our agenda at that time was to our current agenda. But what I really found interesting was the frame, the need to surround all babies with responsive care, recognizing the importance of parents and primary caregivers for laying the emotional foundations of learning, as well as those other caregivers in childcare programs and other settings. It also assumes the policies would apply to all families with young children. The first set of recommendations talks about assuring health coverage for all and also access to services. The next 2 have to do with building the relationships essential for healthy development, starting with unhurried time, not just for parents, but also for childcare providers, which I thought was very interesting. Responsive caregiving would be assured by support for parents, including having childcare and healthcare providers play a larger role in helping parents understand the development and needs of infants and toddlers. And finally, it would assure adequate economic support and the ability to meet material needs. The report sums up its vision for creating the Heart Start by saying what is needed is a commitment to support parents across the board in their most important work, which is, of course, nurturing the development of our future workers, innovators, and leaders. It emphasizes relationships, and the importance of settings and services useful and comfortable for families. So let's hold those ideas as we move forward in time in early childhood policy. Today, 0 to 3's policy agenda is more detailed and focuses more distinctly on programs, but the frame is still what all babies need: good health, strong families, and positive early learning experiences. Bolstered by the detailed data and state of babies, central to our discussion today is how policies can help address the inequities babies and families experience, ensure all babies have access to the resources they need. If you want to learn more about our recommendations, I put the link to our federal policy agenda and reports on policies to build for the future at the bottom of the slide. As in 1992, the key is the power of relationships. Parental support can shape strong foundational brain development and buffer children from the effects of adversity if parents get the proper support. So let's, given that the agenda hasn't changed all that much, let's go back to our history lesson to think about how far we've come and where our child and family policy stood as the pandemic hit in 2020. This year, the 30th anniversary of Heart Start, we're taking stock of where we are in young child and family policy, a 30-year checkup. The list on the slide is certainly not exhaustive, but it includes advances that touch some key needs. The broadest policies center on health coverage, where we've made strides. 95% of children, babies, and families with low income have health coverage, but there's still major gaps, as we know. Family medical leave was intended as a broad structural policy, but its lack of wage replacement makes it a luxury that workers with low wages cannot afford. The child tax credit became a reality in 1997. And while the maximum amount reached $2,000 in the 2017 tax bill, the credit continued to be unavailable or available at a reduced level for the children in poverty who could most benefit from increased income, while the income cap actually moved upward. Child care funding has grown from the $1 billion level we scraped together in 1990, but still reaches only 17% of eligible families. And some of the creative ideas to deliver the Heart Start, such as universal visits at birth and developmental supports in primary care or family resource programs, receive modest to extremely modest levels of funding. So we gather that policy moves piecemeal. Legislation is by nature compartmentalized and sometimes narrowly focused, and few policymakers understand how the pieces fit together. And piecemeal can also mean small and incremental. As 2020 began, the United States was still on the sidelines when it came to families juggling their dual roles as players in the economic life of our country and as the chief nurturers of our future workers. Unlike many, if not most, other industrialized nations, we have not enacted the broad structural policies that recognize and support families in these key roles. The experience of the pandemic exposed what families already knew. Our systems for supporting the health and well-being of young children and families are threadbare to practically non-existent. The pandemic buffeted families more cruelly because our nation lacks national policies such as permanent paid leave, durable basic economic supports, a strong early care and learning system, and supportive outreach to isolated families. Early in the pandemic, 0 to 3 identified 5 critical needs for babies and families that we felt Congress simply must address. And by and large, with one exception, they did come through. Taken together, these responses created a bold experiment in the types of policies that place families with young children on a firm footing. An unprecedented investment in childcare pushed states to think about shoring up a system rather than just providing assistance to a few families, and it helped keep childcare afloat. Economic support stabilized families, starting with enhanced unemployment insurance and direct payments, and then going on to culminate with the enhanced child tax credit that actually cut poverty for children by 30%. Emergency supplements to family support programs help reach more families who were isolated and under stress from the pandemic, and in some cases help deliver things like diapers and other needs that families had. Infant and early childhood mental health was one area that was not well supported, but it was partly because the infrastructure for delivering infant mental health services is so underdeveloped that it was difficult to figure out how you would channel federal funds down to the local level in an expeditious manner. Basic needs were met in sometimes creative ways, such as adding childcare, food, and school lunch payments to benefits from the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP. But sometimes families experience precarious situations, such as eviction moratoria went, and returned, and states were slow to set up efficient channels for the robust housing assistance that ultimately did come through. Nevertheless, these responses were sweeping enough that it gave us hope that they created an opening for the durable policies that families have needed for decades, that our national policymakers would adopt robust, comprehensive policies so our nation's families will never again be set adrift in crisis or in calm. Even at 0 to 3, we sought to embrace simplicity and homed in on 6 areas that would give families the comprehensive policies they've long needed. And 3 of these policies are in the Build Back Better package. The other 3 we're pursuing in appropriations and authorizing legislation. For 6 months or so, as the Build Back Better Act took shape and passed the House, we thought we had a chance at sweeping, transformative progress in making that commitment to children and families, to come closer than ever to universal policies to underpin this basic, essential unit of our society and of our economy. For babies, our hope was that the federal government and states would look at the policies in Build Back Better and see how they could form a moonshot for babies, especially with a robustly funded childcare program that could have grown quality infant toddler services across the nation. But as hopes for Build Back Better have faded, what would stand to gain and what we are already losing has become starker. So we'll start with economic security. The expanded child tax credit paid to families monthly was near universal, most critically extending downward by being refundable to reach babies and families whose families are disconnected from the workforce. It cut poverty in 30%, but its help for families was incalculable. But after Congress failed to extend the enhanced child tax credit into 2022, child poverty increased and material hardship is again on the rise. Paid family and medical leave, even the modest version that came out of the House of Representatives, would be a huge gain for families, promoting greater equity in who can afford to spend time with their babies and family members when they're ill. Now the U.S. remains the only major industrialized nation that does not guarantee this basic support. New parents continue to struggle to take time off with their new babies, and the pandemic has seen over 1 million women who have left the workforce. Build Back Better would have created a childcare entitlement and funded high-quality universal pre-K, promoting more equitable early learning opportunities for young children. Quality childcare is essential if young children's development is to be supported, and those provisions would have provided an entitlement for 92% of all infants and toddlers would be eligible for. It would require quality standards that reach the level of Head Start and Early Head Start. And it would ensure early educators are paid in a manner commensurate with the important work they do, stopping the drain of dedicated providers out of the profession. Without it, we are still facing a child care system that could crumble without long-term support after the American Rescue Act funds are used up in a year or two. And it would have provided relief for parents and early educators who largely finance the current system through high parent fees and poverty wages for the workforce. And going back to our inequities that start before birth, other key components would provide support for an array of maternal and child health programs that would help combat health inequities and maternal mortality. Without them, as we'll soon see in the next State of Babies, some of these conditions will continue and even worsen. In earlier times, these policies rarely had a clear path to enactment or even such serious discussion, so there was no overt decision that families were not a national priority. But now, a real opportunity seems to be slipping away, and what amounts to a choice to push children back or deeper into poverty, leave families scrambling and the childcare system continuing to crumble, and leave families without the ability to take time off work in the midst of an ongoing pandemic. So one of the things I was asked when I was preparing this lecture was, why did Build Back Better falter in the Senate? And it's a complex question, and I'm not sure anyone completely knows the answer or how fruitful it is to even dissect it now. I do think there was an expectation that Democratic legislators would bargain and change the package, but ultimately fall in behind their Democratic president to give him a win that their entire party needed, as shown in a recent poll of families who received the monthly child tax credit payments that have now ended, the payments that have now ended, and the families are now swinging toward the other party. But whatever the reasons, something else is different, and that may be what the poll was picking up. Families' moods and their sense of hope have changed. The weight of the economic and social upheaval of the pandemic has taken its toll, and increasingly they feel left behind. One parent summed it up for the New York Times. The stress just comes from seeing that the rest of society has kind of moved on, and then parents have young kids, and the young kids themselves seem to be forgotten. So where do we go from here? And so I don't have any magic crystal ball, so we have a big question mark around this baby on the slide. Reconciliation, in fact, has shrunk dramatically in scope and scale, but right now there is no package on the table, so everything is conjecture. There's rumors that it will focus more on deficit reduction, as well as some climate policy, but nothing concrete has been made public at this point. We are working diligently to ensure, especially that childcare provisions continue to be included in reconciliation. So our collective task over the next weeks will be to amplify the needs of families who indeed are in danger of being left behind, and urge the administration and key players in Congress to heed that material hardship families have experienced and the inequities that have just deepened throughout the pandemic, and revive these economic policies that would help mitigate those experiences. And another message is that the policy changes and investments to ensure the improved compensation and greater quality and affordability, the investments that are needed in childcare and pre-K are not going to come through what's called regular order of authorization and appropriations. We're looking at more incrementalism at best. So we can talk more in a bit about what you can do to make a difference. But I want to change tax right now. We have to spend so much time working to move a few key policies that it crowds out other important policy areas where we can make advances. So I want to talk about another dimension to fulfilling our 1992 vision that all parents be supported in nurturing their children, which seems to me to be the heart of the conference here. And that is the part that actually interfaces with families. It's also an area in which I've been intensely interested for many years, so it's just great to be able to talk about it. It's not enough to have the big structural policies in place, although that certainly would help strengthen families. But as those policies falter at the national level, the policies and programs at the community level that reach actual families directly become even more important. Every family, and especially those with a baby, needs some measure of support in nurturing development and addressing issues like mental health or getting connected with community services. Often strategies to provide this support are called prevention because the need for so-called upstream approaches is so apparent in our child welfare system. And it's frequently acknowledged that support at an earlier point could have prevented child welfare involvement. We prefer to frame it as family strengthening, to signify the importance of both building on families' assets and promoting positive outcomes. For example, in child development or strong mental health, as well as preventing child abuse and neglect. Striving for universality helps us achieve that family strengthening frame. When it comes to helping families with the needs of being a family, direct contact is a must. So it is now at the community level that we turn back to our original policy question: how do we reach every family and support them in nurturing their children? If communities are to make a commitment to all their families, they must answer this question with strategies, weaving together the approaches that will meet their own local needs and structures. And this is the essence of this approach, is that the families who are going to be taking part in this whole endeavor should be at the heart of designing it. While strategies may have to be built over time in different areas of a community or for different populations, ultimately they should aim for a universal ability for families to access the support they need at the level they need it. As Hartshart said, services that are fully useful and provided in the context of continuing and respectful relationships And let's keep in mind as we talk about these services that ultimately what they are doing is supporting that key relationship between parents or primary caregivers and the young children they are nurturing. In thinking about how to achieve universality, it's helpful to consider approaches that go where the babies are. Two of those places are where babies are born and where they go for all those child visits. Hartshorn, in fact, talked about universal newborn visits, which have been brought to life through Duke's own Family Connects program. And they also talked about placing developmental specialists in pediatric primary care, an approach that's at the center of 0 to 3's Healthy Steps program that gives families more opportunity to spend time getting their questions answered and getting connected with other services they need. Other tried and true approaches include home visiting and neighborhood-based family resource centers, which are hubs of multi-generational support services and opportunities. The ability to support strong early social and emotional development should be infused throughout all of these settings. So I'm just going to touch quickly on some of the examples because I think that you're probably hearing a lot about the programs in this direction. A new benefit in California's Medi-Cal insurance program will enable children and families to access dyadic care, providing services to parents or caregivers and children together. This seems to be a theme of these types of approaches, targeting family well-being as a mechanism to support healthy child development and mental health. The Guilford County, North Carolina Get Ready Guilford initiative integrates 3 anchor programs with proven effectiveness: Family Connects, Healthy Steps, and Nurse Family Partnership to serve more families, but also play a central role in the development of a new system of care. States such as Kentucky, New Jersey, and Vermont, and communities such as Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, and San Francisco have invested in family resource centers to be available for all families. Often they integrate with home visiting and other services to meet families' varied needs. So these approaches are not new. Some of them have been around for decades and some even longer than that. And yet the federal policies that help promote such support, much less make it universal, are at the small incremental part of the policy continuum that we talked about in our 30-year checkup. Community-based child abuse prevention grants are a clear source, but that is funded at $66 million this year, and that has been an uphill struggle. The Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program is one of the larger ones, and it's been funded at $400 million a year. It barely scratches the surface. States have to be very creative to piece together funding from a variety of sources, as do communities, but they also may need a push and some help in doing that. Some ideas for expanding family support range from Medicaid financing to integrating early childhood support in community health centers, to one of the ideas that we are promoting, which is creating flexible umbrella funding to help communities build systems to strengthen families and support all families and young children. And finally, there's a need to continue increase funding for individual approaches such as home visiting or support in primary care. So the answer to our policy query for babies and young children is an array of big structural policies and community-driven support that can build on what the families in any particular community need. But how do we get policymakers to ask that question so that we can give them the answers? And here's some ways that you can help. This is definitely a time when our voices need to be heard, especially for reconciliation, but also to get some of these really creative efforts that are going on in states and communities up to the national attention level. You can use your expertise to stress the needs of families and the urgency of making bold change now. You can connect research and policy so that policymakers can see the science that they may not even realize is behind policies like income support or even paid family and medical leave, where some of them are kind of surprised to think that there's a child development case for both of these. You can share our new State of Babies profiles when they come out to underscore the need to identify those disparities that cut across states and to look at the gaps that need to be filled. And I'm going to make a last shameless plug to join the team that's fighting for our future through the 0 to 3 Policy Network and Think Babies. And on that note, I'm going to close out this not so quick tour of why it matters so much that we see babies, young children, and their families in public policy at the national level. So I thank you so much for watching and listening. I so appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with you. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Patty, thank you so much for that terrific overview of the policy and legislative landscape. We really appreciate it. I want to encourage our audience to join in the conversation now, just like you have throughout the day. We've really appreciated your thoughtful questions and your engagement. We have our first question, Patty, from Nancy, who says, I've been in early childhood education for 50 years in August 2022, and I'm frustrated with the progress we've made in the United States. Any suggestions to help me not get discouraged?
I feel what you're feeling. I've been working in infant, toddler, children's policy for 35 years or so, and it's hard to not get discouraged, to feel like we had this opportunity that seemed so clear, and now we seem to be working so hard. So I think it's that we all have to take strength from each other, take strength and hope from our families that we're working for, and try to make one last push for this particular opportunity with reconciliation and try to get something big for early childhood education. And then I think we'll do, if it works, then we'll be out there on the implementation trail. If not, then I think we'll do what we've done for many years, which is pick ourselves up again and just keep pushing. But I wish I had some magic words to make everybody, feel energized. And I hope we will get energized. I think we still have the opportunity. One thing I will say is that when I worked for Chris Dodd, he was such a champion for children, and he was always out there, even when his colleagues, ran and hid behind a column or something, so when they saw him coming. And I will say that Patty Murray and people like Rosa DeLauro as well have been such champions, and I like to call Patty Murray the lioness of the Senate. They are not going to stop until Joe Biden is putting ink on that bill when he signs it. So we just all have to keep the faith and know that if we don't do it, it'll never happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a question from Kay, who's asked you to say more about the time-sensitive need to take action in terms of the budget reconciliation process right now.
So, sometimes it's hard to figure out the exact timing for when. We've asked the field so much to that this is it. You've got to weigh in now. This is it, and then we come back a few weeks later. This is really it. Right? And this is sort of it in the next few weeks. I think right now Congress is taking a nice recess. So I think what we're trying to do is gather ourselves so that when they come back, we'll be ready to pounce. I think we have our actions up at 0 to 3 to continue keeping up the drumbeat for the major policies that young children need. But I think as they come back out of the recess, my sense is that's when decisions are going to start being made, that they've finished the Supreme Court nomination. They will have their break. They're going to come back, and they know they have a crowded calendar for the rest of the year. They know they really need to get something done, maybe not done, but moving by Memorial Day. And it feels like they're on a better track to talk among themselves to figure out what that course is. But that's when, at that moment, when they're starting to refocus, is when we need to amp up. So I'm thinking that you can still make your voice heard from now for the next week or two, but then it's really going to be go time. One of the things that we're doing with the State of Babies release is it's really going to try to make the point that the data, some of the data that you'll see, it's still going to be pre-pandemic. And we'll have the rapid EC data. But one of the points is that, so these big indicators don't move very fast, but why would they? We don't change what we're doing very much. So we want to make the point that you have to do some big things now, and this is the opportunity. So it's really trying to create then that cadence that they're hearing what families need. They're hearing about the experiences that families are having. They're very real and very concerning. So yeah, but I think from now to the end of May, it's really, it's the time to make your voice heard.
Yes, thank you very much for pointing the way there. So the next question from Rachel is that the goal is to provide every child with the opportunity to reach her potential. However, the reality is that there are limited resources that must be prioritized. Where do you think the limited resources should be prioritized?
So I think on the one hand, the simple answer to that question is really, so we look at the families that have the greatest needs, the greatest burdens, and are the most under-resourced. But the whole point of this exercise for the past year of doing big things, first through the American Rescue Plan for COVID release, and then the policies on Build Back Better, is that we can do more than just allocate scarce resources. We pay for a lot of things, but when it comes to children and families, we can't afford what they need. And so right now we're still in a mode of, you need to do these big things for family. They're really important. You're leaving babies behind. And so we're not back yet in the mode of, we have scarce resources. We need to devote them to the families that need them most, and that's where we'll be. But certainly focusing on expanding those early learning opportunities for the families that right now don't have them, and expanding, continuing to work on things like paid leave, especially expanding early Head Start as a really wonderful model, and really important for families, those young babies in poverty. So the other things that we will focus on doing is really trying to build up that infrastructure for infant and early childhood mental health, which is underdeveloped, but is hopefully picking up steam.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the impact of the pandemic and the policy shifts that happened during that. Is there anything you could say about what we've learned from the experience in the pandemic in terms of policy changes, and that how that might help us lead the way forward?
Right. As I said earlier, when you step back and think about what was done during the pandemic, there were really bold steps, especially for the United States, to do things like put in the first did the direct stimulus payments and the unemployment insurance, but then the child tax credit. And I saw that question about, how do you take those lessons of those material needs are really critical to, how well our country is doing and how well families are doing. And it's, if you can't look at what happened with the child tax credit and see that there was this drop in poverty, but even more important, listen to what families said they did with it. They were able to pay utilities